Okay, I think we're going to get started here in just a minute. Um, Before we do, I wanted to take on just a little bit of housekeeping. Um, and to say that I see that Congressman Mark Takano has checked in. So Congressman, we would like to give you an opportunity to say something. We'll have to change your status from audience to panelist. So if you can send me a note either in the question and answer um, function, or also I sent you a private chat asking if you would like to say something, then we'll be sure to get that taken care of because we would like to hear from you if you would like to say something. So in the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and get started. My name is Teresa Hanley, and I'd like to welcome you all to our presentation this afternoon, The Economics of Wars, Depressions, and Pandemics. This is presented by the Mission Inn Foundation, which is Mission Inn Foundation and Museum, which is a nonprofit organization exploring the history and importance of the Mission Inn and its relationship to our community. One little known aspect of that history is that Frank Miller, the founder of the Mission Inn, was a peace activist. The Peace and Friendship Tower on Mount Rubidoux is dedicated to him and his efforts to promote peace and international understanding. So today's presentation is part of our project we call Toward Peace, which is a multifaceted project exploring this history of Miller and his activism, particularly in the years before World War I. So as we were putting our project together, it occurred to us that we probably should find a way to acknowledge the fact that though Miller and his World War I era peace activists were ultimately unsuccessful. Fortunately for us, Riverside's own Roger Ransom had recently published a book on the origins of World War I. We asked Roger to participate in our project, and he readily agreed. And then the pandemic. And so as we have been altering our programs to fit this current situation that we find ourselves in, Roger asked us if he could expand the focus of his talk to include something related to our contemporary situations. And it was our turn to say a ready yes. Now, we are proud that our project Toward Peace is made possible with support from California Humanities, which is a nonprofit partner of the National Endowment for the Humanities. You can visit calhum.org, calhum.org, to learn more about them and the many fine programs they support throughout California. I would also like to thank our local sponsors, Judith Ott, Sally and Chuck Beatty, Kathy Wright and Dwight Tate, and Walter Parks. All right, so at this point, I would like to introduce my fellow Toward Peace Planning project developer, Vince Moses, who will introduce our speaker.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to this beautiful afternoon in Riverside. I've been given the privilege, and I say that sincerely, the privilege of introducing our presenter today. Now, most of you know him or have been one of his students. Today, I'm introducing Dr. Roger Ransom, distinguished professor of history and economics at the University of California, emeritus. He took his BA at Reed College, and if you've ever been to Portland, Oregon, you know that is a beautiful, beautiful place. His PhD at the University of Washington. Roger's specialization is American economic history and 19th century US history with an emphasis on the Civil War and 20th century world wars. Dr. Ransom came to UCR in 1968 from stints at UC Berkeley and elsewhere, taught in the economics department until 1984, then moved to the history department for the remainder of his career, where I knew him. He was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship in 1988 and 89, Arthur Cole Award from the Economic History Association in 1986, 2003 was awarded the UCR Distinguished Teaching Award and named Distinguished Humanist Achievement Lecturer for 2005-06 by the University of California Center for Ideas and Society at UCR. 2015-16 appointed Edward Dixon Distinguished Professor of History and Economics, and his awards go on and on, along with being past president of the Economic History Association. Dr. Ransom has 7 notable books. I won't read you all of them, but a couple that he's really are classics. One Kind of Freedom, The Economic Consequences of Emancipation with Richard Such. I believe Dr. Ransom is correct. And it was second edition in 2001. It's the best I think the econometric analysis of slavery and emancipation out there anywhere. He's proud of his counterfactual historical work too. What might have been Confederate States of America, what might have been, looking at what the world would look like, the United States would look like if in fact the Confederate States had won that war. And then of course today, he will use his latest book as the springboard for this presentation. It's entitled Gambling on War, Confidence, Fear, and the Tragedy of the First World War, Cambridge University Press, 2018. And I think he's working on a sequel to that one. So Dr. Ransom, the floor is all yours, sir.
Thank you very much. I haven't done this before, and so pardon me if I fumble around. But I'm very pleased that Teresa and the foundation invited me to give this lecture. They actually started talking about the the talk I was going to give, as Vince mentioned, because of the publication of my book on gambling on war. And that was in February 2020, and a lot has happened since then, which caused me to go back over my files of memorable strips from a comic strip called Calvin and Hobbes. And it's all about a little boy who's forever talking to his tiger and bringing up very deep questions with very deep answers. And as I was preparing this PowerPoint that I'm putting on, I was reminded not only of what you see on the screen now, which is Calvin making a statement that anybody who has really studied history at all will understand right away, which is we don't understand what really causes events to happen. And that's why we have to get new versions of history to bring us up to date. But I was reflecting on another one that I didn't dig the pictures out, but it's a picture of Calvin and his parents in a car going over a bridge. And the bridge has a sign saying how many tons the bridge can bear. And so Calvin asked the obvious question, Dad, how do they know that the bridge is going to hold up that much weight? The father, without hesitation, answers, well, what they do is they just get trucks and they keep driving them over, and each one's a little bit heavier than the last one. And when the bridge collapses, they know how heavy what load the bridge can have. And from the back seat, we hear her mother saying, why do you encourage him? Why do you encourage him? Well, anyway, the reason I remember that is because this PowerPoint presentation is kind of like that. I've been away from PowerPoint for quite a while. I retired in 2010. And I've been kind of driving this PowerPoint over the bridge to see if it's going to collapse. It hasn't collapsed yet. So I guess we can proceed with the story that I want to tell. It's a story of wars and a story of crises and economic crises, and of course, the perfect storm that we're caught in today. And economists have a very hard time making sense of any decisions to start wars because their theoretical models assume rational behavior. Now, that's kind of a very distinguished way of saying they think people are supposed to be making sense, and they're not. And in fact, starting with the war that has been the last major focus of my career, World War I, In 1914, no one wanted a major war among all the major powers of Europe. In fact, they had constructed an elaborate system of treaties with each other to prevent such an outcome. But the decisions that led to the First World War are the product of what happens when you combine fear, overconfidence, and the pressure to, God damn it, do something. Do it now. Do it now. You tend to act a little rashly, and sometimes you don't think things through too well. And that's what happened in late July and early August of 2014, following the assassination of the Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand. It created a huge economic crisis because Austria was very unhappy with the Serbs. And eventually, after exchanging a few angry telegrams, the Austrians simply decided to solve the problem for them, which was what to do with Serbia, by attacking them. So Austria attacked Serbia, and with the intent to probably annex it. But the problem with this is that the Russians, who like the Serbs, decide they need to step in to help their allies. And so they declare war on Austria. Well, that's still not a disaster, but it's getting there because, unfortunately for the world, the Austrians, before they attacked the Serbians, had asked the Kaiser in Germany, would he help them and make sure that Russia doesn't intervene if they attack Serbia? Well, Russia does intervene, so Germany declares war on Russia. Again, a little bit predictable, kind of expected the Germans had come to the Serbs' aid. But the Germans decide that what we have to do then is invade France. Now, only in the mind of a German high command late one August night would this make any sense. But the problem was the Germans had a plan for a war if they got involved with a war in Russia and France. And that plan was to invade France, knock out the French, and then turn their attention to the Russians. But when the Germans invade, technically, they invade Belgium on their way to France. Great Britain, again, late at night, after a long and very contentious argument, Great Britain declares war on Germany. So now, what has happened in the space of 3 days is Russia, being mad with Serbia, has turned into a world war that is divided, that will eventually be divided into powers, into sections of countries called the Entente powers: France, Russia, Great Britain, and then Italy joins in 1915. The United States joins in 1917, opposed to the Central powers of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. In other words, they had a world war. No one was prepared for a conflict of this size. They all had huge armies and complex plans to fight a war. They were all confident that any war would be short. But Schlieffen's plan was a gamble that the German army could go through Russia. Now, this is before jet planes and speed and tanks and so forth. Going to march through Belgium on the way to France, get all the way east of Paris and force the French to surrender, and do all of this before the Russians could invade Germany. This is called overconfidence. Overconfidence. But that did not slow the Germans up. They did it. It failed. They didn't even get east of Paris, much less force the French to surrender. But the real problem here is that everybody had all these plans. No one had a plan B. So when the Schlieffen plan falls apart, the Germans are stuck behind the Marne River in northern France. And it doesn't look like they're going to go anywhere very fast. Now, one of the less celebrated comments that came out of the early mess of getting to the war was General Erich von Falkenhayn, who urged the Kaiser just before Christmas to seek a peace settlement with Germany while Germany still had an advantage. He wanted basically the Germans to say, okay, didn't work, but we'll take what we've got. Now, whether that would have worked or not is a moot point, because the Kaiser never seriously considered it. So what emerged and became famous throughout the world was a stalemate in northern France. And the stalemate would go on for 5 years, well, just under 5 years. We in America, when I was a kid, I'll come back to this point later. When I was a kid and learning all about this, all of the emphasis of World War I was on the Western Front, the famous movie, All Quiet on the Western Front. In fact, the Western Front was smaller than the Eastern Front where Germany and Russia fought. It wasn't really very much larger than the one that the Italians had down here in Italy. And the reason we call it the First World War is because these countries carried with them a whole bunch of other areas that got dragged into the war because they were either participants or they were colonies. And the World War actually extended not just up here in the corner where France, this is what Americans learned about. And it is the only place where Americans fought in any numbers during the war. But the rest of the world was busy changing too. And the effects of the war would be vastly even larger than this map, all down in here. The First World War was a huge undertaking. Now, what's really interesting is that in the spring of 1918, the German army was once again about 50 miles from Paris. They just missed it from the Schlieffen Plan, but they got back there. In December of 1917, the Russians had surrendered to the Germans, and in fact, a peace treaty ended the war between Germany and Russia. And Germany, in the winter of 1917, spring of 1918, basically tripled the area that they controlled. They had huge territorial gains in the east. So it sure looks to the casual observer as though the Germans are winning the war. So how do we explain that in November 1918, the Germans asked for a ceasefire? They want to quit, and they want to quit in a hurry. Why? Well, it's not because of military reasons. It's not because of military defeats and victories and so on. All that killing wasn't really what determined and made them stop fighting. What made them stop fighting is that the German economy was running on empty. The effort demanded of men, machines, armaments, and food is, this is a graph from my book, and I'll go through it quickly. And incidentally, if I'm going through things too quickly, chat with the controller to submit a question. Now, what happened is that in terms of food, German agricultural production fell to just under half. Industrial output fell. GDP fell early by about 15%, and it just stays even. But you're not going to win a war if you just stay even. Remember, 60% of that GDP is going to the war effort by the end of the war. In other words, the reason that Hindenburg and his compatriots sought a ceasefire in 1918 is they faced a revolution at home. They might have won major military gains, but they were facing a revolution back home, and they wanted out while the getting out was good. So it comes to an abrupt end because the Allies agree to a ceasefire. And none of the problems that started the war, which would be the rivalry and so forth, leading up to 1914, none of that is solved. The Treaty of Versailles was nothing more than a 20-year armistice. In fact, a French general famously predicted that when right after the treaty was signed at Versailles in France in June of 1918, he said, this will be a 20-year armistice. He was only off by a year. Treaty of Brest-Litovsk and the Bolshevik was not only ended the war with Russia, it also meant the Bolshevik victory in Russia, which led to the establishment of the Soviet Union, inflation and economic chaos, made Germany and Austria political and economic disasters for the next decade. More than 20 new nations and colonial territories were organized. And there was continued fighting over borders. And ultimately, the part that catches the eye of military historians like me, the rise of totalitarian regimes in Italy, Germany, and Japan. Now, in 1929, the stock market collapsed. I used to have to go to great pains to explain this to my students, but I don't have to explain it now. We all know what a stock market crash is. The picture you see is a graph depicting the decline of stocks in 1933-29. That's the great stock market crash of 1929. And what I want to particularly point out is notice these little upticks. See? They all pause. They say, oh, it's done. We reinvest. But as my good friend, dear friend, Richard Suss used to say, the optimists get hammered. They have a 35% loss. They make some of it back. We're over the hump, bang, 18.7 loss, and on down. It's a series, well, modern day people call a waterfall. And it, without question, is the worst economic collapse in American history, 80% in 3 years. And this is followed, and I'm not going to try and go into much detail here, but this is followed by a decade of economic stagnation. One of my oversights I see is I forgot to label the graph that's up there. This is indices of GNP, which were set for 100 in 1929. And then look what happens. The UK, well, they're coming off a rocky period, as is everyone else, comes to the crash, they go down, but they quietly but surely work their way up to 1937. The United States, on the other hand, utterly collapses, almost 50%. Now, you can put that into a little bit of perspective of what's happening now. I noted that the third quarter outlook for the United States this year was down 30%. Well, this is a 50% decline in the space of 2 years in gross domestic product. The Germans are hit almost as hard, but both the Americans and the Germans, this is the Roosevelt. I didn't learn how to turn that off when I was using this PowerPoint. That's the Great Depression, and that's the bottom of the stock market. And from there, the Germans and the Americans both make a recovery. The Americans don't succeed for too long. They have another serious decline in 1937 that no one ever talks about, but it's a serious setback. And then after that, they finally they get back to the 1900 level at about 1940, just after we get into World War II. The Germans, you'll notice, keep merrily going on off the graph. That's because the Germans have found one of the answers to the difficulty of economic unemployment and so forth, and that is you put people, excuse me, you get people to build tanks, airplanes, and so forth. They are back to work, and the German rearmament. It would be too much to say that it actually got them out of the Depression, but it certainly helped. I shouldn't have taken a drink. It actually helped quite a bit. The Americans actually experienced exactly the same thing after 1941, because what got us the Great Depression was not exactly the New Deal. It was rather the war effort to get over and win the war. Now, at one point, I want to point this out as something that we're going to talk about with regard to the present. The thing the thing about the economic organizations and mobilization for war is that while they are a drag on the consumer sector and consumer demand and supply, they are a boom in total demand, building guns and so forth. What we talked about was the downfall of the Germans in World War I. They were going to make damn sure that it wasn't going to be their downfall again. Now, by 1936, the world is on the verge of another world war. And the Japanese are controlling, the militarists are in control, and they want to establish what's called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. This is called a poor choice of naming things if you want to be a publicist in the United States. Did not go over well with the United States at all, particularly when the Japanese proceeded to invade China in 1937. And in fact, the Japanese were at war with China from 1937 to 1945, something that has tended to get lost in the history books that I read when I was a kid in school. In 1941, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. That one is familiar to you. Adolf Hitler is Führer of Germany. He wants to rebuild the German Empire in Eastern Europe and beyond. In 1939, the Germans invade Poland. 1940, they invade France. 1941, the final and most disastrous decision they make, Operation Barbarossa, they invade the Soviet Union. Now, oh yes, and then Italy follows along. They are part of the triumvirate that will become known as the Axis powers. They attack Ethiopia in 1937. Now, the thing about the Second World War, in one sense, it's deja vu all over again. We are getting we are getting a series of decisions, but unlike the decisions that took place in the space of a couple of weeks for World War I, in which no one knew what they were doing, this is all planned. The Japanese, the Germans, and the Italians all were looking for the possibility that a military success, even though it may be a gamble that could fail, will succeed and allow them to build the empire. For the Germans, World War II is, we shouldn't have stopped in World War I. It turns out that that's not very good thinking, but they think, well, if we had the economic power, we could have gone ahead. So we're going to get ready going to get it all ready to go to begin with. And they're going to gamble that these efforts, things like the invasion of Russia, so forth. The problem is all of those military successes fail. All of them fail. They produced a situation where by the end of 1943, the Russians have stopped the Germans at Moscow and Stalingrad. They're about to make their move, which will ultimately drive them all the way to Berlin. The Americans have crippled the Japanese fleet at Midway only 6 months after Pearl Harbor. And this is one of the greatest, in terms of, if you drop the patriotism out of it, the Japanese, the defeat of the Japanese fleet at Midway is one of the most decisive naval victories in history. The Japanese never recovered from that. They lost 4 of their 6 carriers, aircraft carriers, which was the heart of the Imperial Japanese Navy, and they never really recovered. It took a long time. It took some men lives, in terms of moving back up the north from Guadalcanal. But by 1943, the Japanese were done in terms of any chances of winning. The British have stopped the German and the Italian forces at El Alamein. This is the defeat of Rommel. And basically, the reason things are, quote, over in 1943 is because the problem of facing the Axis powers is they lack the economic power to sustain their war effort. So having made the decision, which was a gamble, that they're going to launch these attacks and that these attacks will be successful and produce something that they want, which is basically territory. It's over. They tried, they failed, and they don't have the economics to carry it on. It's not a military question. Both sides both had some successful, but basically the successes, the military successes, were more on the side of the Allies because the Allies were just building up an incredible economic difference that the Germans and the Japanese and the Italians couldn't match. So let's just say it's 1945 and we won. You know, we did. Unlike World War I, where we sort of agreed to a ceasefire that ultimately produced chaos. This time, Japan, Germany, Italy, the Axis powers are invaded, covered, and we're going to get a new world. It is not a perfect world, but if you look at what I've been talking about, a friend of mine, not so much a friend, an economic historian who I admire very much, called the period 1914 to 1945 an age of catastrophes. And when I was writing my book on the First World War, what I saw myself as doing was basically trying to explain these two horrendous wars. The Russo-Japanese War, this graph is measuring the number of casualties, deaths in the various wars. And the height of the little bar tells you how far you go. And you can see that there's a bunch of other wars, but you can hardly see them on the graph compared to what's happening in World War II and World War I. Those wars were catastrophes that changed all sorts of things. The world was no longer the same. And financially, panics in 1907, 1914, 1932, and so forth. It was a world which was a perfect storm. Now, that's when I arrived. And I say that, I was born in 1938. The reason I say that is that from here on out, the history that I'm dealing with is a history that I lived through. Tom Brokaw famously called the generation represented by my parents as the greatest generation of Americans who ever lived, because they saw us through all of this mess that you see here. The war, the Depression, another war, and now into a new world. And the new world is what I'm growing up to. And I'm old enough now that I can say that I have learned the history of these wars in this period twice at least, once as a student, once as a professor teaching it. And the two stories are not exactly the same. They change as time goes on. The most obvious being the story of what happened with regard to the Soviet Union, which when I was growing up was the dreaded enemy that had emerged in World War II after we saved them. It was commonplace for people to think, well, the Soviets should be friendly with us and like us because we saved them in World War II. Nothing could be further from the truth. The Soviet Union in 1939 was one of the, if not the, most powerful military systems in the world. Stalin may have not have been the best of rulers. He may have done all sorts of things wrong for his people, but he prepared the Soviet Union for World War II. And he won, just barely, but he won. So I'm living through, as a child, the post-war period of what happens between 1945 and now. And it's, it's not a perfect story, but there aren't any more world wars. And everything seems to be moving along pretty well. Pretty well. But in 2020, a new perfect storm arises. The economy collapses. This is the worst economic crisis since the Depression of 1930s. Whether it's worse than the 1930s, we don't know because it's not over yet. And to make this a perfect storm, a COVID virus pandemic causes 8 million cases of infection and 220,000 deaths. The 220,000 deaths are actually as much as we lost, more than we lost in World War I. And by the time it's over, probably will have lost more people through deaths because of this pandemic than we did in the two world wars. We still have a ways to go because we did lose 400,000 some odd in World War II. But this is a perfect storm. And the question is, how do we deal with it? Because for an economist or an economic historian, what makes this pandemic and perfect storm now so difficult to deal with is that the variables don't behave the way most variables have behaved in economic depressions in the past. What you see there is the Dow Jones Index from March of 2000 to 2020 up until I think it's Thursday, just passed, which means that this is called examining history, writing history as it happens. And it involves a great deal of patience because I had to stop each time I got here and I thought, oh, now what's going to happen next? And so you have to wait for it to happen before you can write the history of it. And we're only a few days ahead of reality. But this is the Dow Jones. Now, the Dow Jones Index is by no means a perfect index or even a good index of the economic activity and health of the general economy. But there's one person in the United States who actually thinks it is the best. And I have used it as an index of confidence, at least. And what you see is the Dow Jones Index, the crash of 2020. I describe it many times when I'm talking to people as the worst financial crash we've had. Now, I put back up in the lower right-hand part there. Remember that little diagram with all the little arrows and everything? This is in the end is a worse decline, but this is 2 years. 2 years. This is a month. To understand the impact of the great crash of 2020, you have to consider the fact of how fast it happened. Nobody was ready for it. I mean, you could get snapshots of, from MSNBC and so forth. Their financial expert, and early on they say, well, that's because there were some things wrong in the stock market and this is a correction. And then it's getting a little out of hand. And by the time you get to the middle of this crash, they're beginning to say, maybe it's because people are worried about what's happening somewhere else. We'll come back to that. The interesting thing is that after that crash, we got a boom market. We've had a boom market since actually the boom market, I think, measures from here. And this is what I call the world according to Trump. It says, look, here's your V recovery. And we're on the way. We've turned the corner, as he is fond of saying. Now, the problem with that interpretation is that there was more happening than just the Dow Jones. Take your eyes off the Dow Jones for a minute. And down here, these little bars here, this measures the number of initial jobless claims. It's what the Labor Department regards as the quickest and best measure of weekly unemployment in the United States. And this means that these are the guys applying for the first time. This is people who are continuing. Now, if you look at this, you can see that the unemployment is rising just as fast as the market is. And that is, in fact, where Joe Biden gets his K recovery. You have to sort of switch that. You have to sort of switch that to the angle. But while this is considered healthy, this is not healthy. And moreover, with the help of Congress and the CARES Act and some other stuff, the Labor Department, every Department of Labor of the United States, every 2 weeks puts out a figure that is the total number of workers receiving some form of aid. And this is workers who are receiving emergency aid. Now, if you look at those, you say, does that destroy that suggests that the economy is not real healthy? You know, what it suggests is we're barely breathing. But they say, oh, don't worry, don't panic. Look at this. Look at this. It's falling. It's falling. As this is in the space of 6 months, it goes from something that is, I forgot to put the percentage. This this is about 17 or 18 or 19%. And it's fallen down to something below 10%. So we are recovering. Well, we have to mitigate that a little bit. We're recovering, but these 25 million workers, these people in this area, they are still unemployed and they're still receiving. So the level of unemployment actually stays above 25 million, and estimates are as high as 40 or 45 million of how many people actually lost their jobs because of the economic recession. And before we jump with glee at how successful this is, what was the unemployment back when we started? Oh, there it is. There it is, yeah. This was the unemployment for the previous 8 months. It just runs off. It's not even a million. So when we jump for joy here, let's remember that we're still a long ways from here. This is not a recovery. You're still headed for a disaster. Now, as if the economic side of things wasn't enough, the problem is at exactly this point when the market is bottoming out, the deaths from COVID virus arrive in the United States. You see them arriving here, they and it's rising right up there with the stock market. And this is an interesting combination. We have 210,000 deaths, and we have the stock market getting almost back to where it was. There are a lot of implicit and explicit trade-offs that one can talk about there. But what I found interesting is, oops, we don't want to do that yet. What I found interesting is the other statistic that comes out are the new cases of COVID infections. Now, this is on, again, a daily basis. And here it is, since we don't have it. It goes way up. At this point, it's reaching upwards of 30,000. Then they're saying, what? We are not exactly flattening the curve, as the governor of New York said. We are still experiencing, at its peak, this is about 67,000 cases a day for the United States. Now let's take a closer look at that. Because the real issue here is, can we control the virus? And the answer is, sure we can, but it turns out we can't do it for too long. If you look at the beginning, the initial surge, look at this is 4 northeastern states, New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania. Watch what happens to them, right? It goes up, goes down and it stays down. Now, what is interesting about this graph is that this point right here, they're all together. At this point, we have managed to overcome the surge in the Northeast. The other states are doing enough that they've lowered, and they're all sort of right at the same level, something on the order of 5,000 deaths per day. That's not enough to be really good, but it helps. But then we open up. Oh, yeah. That's the price of opening up. That's particularly, look at this, for even 5 states all by themselves, California, Arizona, Georgia, Florida, and Texas. They by themselves combine for more than 35,000 cases per day. That's this point right here. And the total for the country as a whole is over 65,000 per day. Uh-oh, Panicville will pause. So then everyone pauses, and woo, down we go. Not as far as we'd like, but there's a pretty good contribution here. But the problem is, what this shows, in my judgment, is yes, we can control, but we have to do it. And controlling it turns out to be a tricky matter. We know we can choose to fight the virus by social distancing, but that has some costs because it slows economic activity. We know if we choose to ignore the virus by opening up, all hell will break loose. A lot of people will get sick and some of them will die. Not all of them. Suppose we had flattened the curve at the point where everybody was sort of just rethinking and succeeded in keeping it flat at about 20,000 cases per day. The shaded area above this whole area there then would not have happened. The counterfactual is that it would have leveled off. And that shaded area represents the number of infections which could have been avoided, if everybody kept behaving like this when it was like this. I think it's a little more useful way than just saying the administration screwed up and all 210,000 deaths are due to them. Actually, I have not tried to calculate the deaths, but the simple geometry tells us that this is about half of the 8 million deaths that this area represents could have been avoided. That's a pretty good gain. So we still don't understand what really causes events to happen. Calvin's right, and he was right when I read this a long time ago. And he still helps me by driving our truck back and forth across the bridge all the time. But on a week from Tuesday, you will have a chance to decide whether science and skill is going to overcome ignorance and fear. And I have one very simple message. Just vote. Just vote. It's not going to save us from the pandemic. The pandemic is not something that economic adjustments can cure, but it can help control it, and it can allow us to weather the storm and emerge to a happy tomorrow. That's it.
Well, thank you very much. I'm sure we're all applauding in our socially distant way. And I am feeling very sorry that even though I was a graduate student at UCR, for some reason, I never took a class from Roger Ransom. And I've learned my lesson now. We are going to have some questions. And I failed at the beginning to let everybody know that even though we've disabled your cameras and your mics and so on, you can ask questions through the question and answer that on your toolbar, it says Q&A. You have to type them. So if you are interested in asking Professor Ransom a question, please do that. And then in the meantime, we've also figured out how to enable Congressman Takano's camera and mic. And so I think that we are hopefully going to see him. There he is on our screens, and we're pleased to have him with us. So, Congressman, you have the floor.
Well, I won't take very long. I just want to thank the Mission Inn Foundation and certainly Professor Emeritus Roger Ransom, UCR Professor Emeritus Roger Ransom, for an excellent presentation. I am anxious for a number of reasons. I am looking at my emails every day from Speaker Pelosi about how close we are to a second relief package. And I still am hopeful that we may get one done before the election. The combination of the Federal Reserve action to purchase corporate assets and to use monetary tools, along with the CARES Act, an enormous fiscal action, both combined, I think, made things less worse than could be. No way, as Professor Ransom has showed us, has it really significantly staunched our unemployment issue. So let me just say that I thank Professor Ransom for clearly showing the opportunity we have on Election Day and the choice we have with skill and confidence that we may have a shot in making the pandemic less worse than it could be. So with that, I just want to ask Professor Ransom a question using my privileged moment here. The calculus that Majority Leader McConnell is making, along with many Republicans, is they're worried about 2022 when they believe that the Republican Party will return to being the party of austerity and so-called fiscal responsibility. And therefore, it makes this current negotiation over a relief bill really problematic. I've been using with people the example of our posture during World War II about whether we worried much about deficits and the national debt when we mounted our effort to fight fascism, imperial and Nazism and authoritarianism, those regimes during World War II. Professor, what do you have to say about the idea about debt politics, deficit politics, as we look to what the federal government must do in the next, say, 6 to 8 months?
Am I on?
Yes.
Well, I don't have an answer, but I can, as an economic historian, if you want to know how we dealt with this problem in World War II, the answer is we didn't pay a lot of attention to inflation or to prices, but we basically just went ahead, we borrowed the money, we won the war. So suppose we spend money like mad, we wind up with a huge debt. We are then carrying that debt. The World War II debt ultimately disappeared because of inflation. And to demonstrate just how big that inflation was, when I was a graduate student taking a job at the University of Virginia, actually, my salary, my annual salary was $7,200. $7,200. And that was considered one of the best contracts that anyone in my graduating class was offered. Today, that doesn't even meet a monthly sort of requirement for people who are barely on the edge. And what happened, of course, is that gradually inflation eroded away the quote cost of the debt, because when you were buying 25 cents a gallon gasoline, the fact that the federal debt was a little bit out of whack wasn't a problem. I think you remember perhaps one of the most common wartime stories of a general who wanted to act quickly and get it done was Farragut down at Mobile. He was bringing his ships into the bay around in Alabama, and his men, one of his vice admirals turned to him and said, "Shouldn't we do something about the torpedoes?" And he said, "Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead. We've got to win this war." And that's the way it is. I mean, the Republicans can decide to become fiscal conservatives again, but you just say, go with it. If people don't want to be taxed, if people don't want to pay that, then so be it. But it's going to be an unfortunate future. And I would just point out that we treat inflation a little differently than we used to. Right now, 2% is not only considered okay, they get upset if it's not at least 2%. So I think what you can expect, the worst case scenario you can expect, is that if they go ahead with this, is that they will simply let the inflation go enough that eventually the debt won't be smaller, but in real terms, it will be smaller in money terms, which means that it'll go away. We did ultimately wound up with what happens is the Federal Reserve simply buys up all those bonds. But I mean, fiscal responsibility is just clashing here with the expediency of doing something quickly, because if you don't do something quickly, it's going to get much, much worse.
All right. Does that answer your question, Congressman?
I think so. I think we're on the same page. We could play with Trump's line during his town hall. The cure cannot be worse than the problem. That's a strange assertion to me, because it seems to me we are in a World War II analogous situation where we have to be expedient to take care of the problem. Not taking care of the problem is also very dangerous.
Well, this comes. Am I back on?
Okay, Roger, we do have a couple of other questions from the audience.
Well, let me just make one quick comment.
Okay, good.
Let me make one quick comment. The point there is that the problem with fighting the pandemic is that one solution creates a problem on the other hand. And I think that what you have to remember is that this is probably going to be a difficult trade-off, at least for the next 18 months or so.
Okay. So our first question came in the early part of your presentation from Dino, and it says, could technology have played a role in the rapidity of the events of the July crisis, since the governments of the European powers rushed through their decisions rather than take time to consider other options?
Well, technology didn't, in one sense, technology played a huge role in determining World War I, because it produced these huge battleships and these big guns and machine guns and a military technology that could totally change the way wars are fought. What happens is that you fall into then a problem that that technology was enough to encourage people to start the wars, but they couldn't. It was not until 1917, 1918 that technology begins to really hit and have an impact on the war with the airplane and the tank. But that's a longer story than I can get into right now. Technology did play a role in ending the war, because the Americans and the British used a technology that was extremely effective and helped offset what had been siege warfare. But in 1914, wars were still supposedly fought with millions of men marching across the ground and getting gunned down.
Thank you. And then our second question more recently comes from Terry Bopp, and it says, can you explain the combination of the Dow Jones and unemployment? Looks to me like the Dow is not showing us how things economically are not real, meaning the market shows us what we want to believe if the vaccine is available. I believe we could have a straight line for a couple of years after this election. What do you think? Thank you.
Well, very quickly on the Dow Jones. The Dow Jones right now is not reflecting the state of the economy well at all. Unfortunately, the Dow Jones is 30 companies. And how well those 30 companies are doing, and many of them are doing very well, they're not suffering from the effects of unemployment. Where the disconnect is that the Dow is only measuring the part of the market that is reflected by the big corporations. And I think, and a lot of people, you look at Barron's and they're all reflecting this. They say the Dow has ceased to be a good measure of the health of the economy. What it is now is more a measure of the inequality that exists between those who hold stocks, IRAs, and so forth, and those who do not.
Okay. All right. If anyone else has any other questions, please put them into the question and answer, the Q&A on your bar real quick. I'm going to take this opportunity to thank everyone for being here again. And to let you know what another thing I failed to mention at the beginning is that we have been recording the webinar. So you will be able to see it in a recorded version of it, or share information about it with anyone you think might be interested. Vince, did you have anything you wanted to say or add?
Well, I want to thank Professor Ransom for his usual erudite and very clear presentation of complex issues and bringing us to date to deal with this current crisis.
And we actually have one more question, Professor. It says, this from Linda Freeman, how does the labor participation rate work for the future?
The labor participation rate?
Yes.
I'm not sure. You're getting into somewhere that's extremely difficult to estimate at this time, because the labor participation rate varies for social as well as economic reasons. It has to do with the family structure and who in the labor force is working. I see that there's no reason for the labor participation force in the long run to not return to normal if you can at least get the markets back into some sort of stable situation where all these people who have lost their jobs, in fact, are able to find some sort of alternative. But I wouldn't necessarily say there'd be a huge change in the labor participation rate.
Okay, we have another one that's popped up if you're game. Could the world wars be considered a classic Thucydides trap between Great Britain and Germany? Are we moving towards a new Thucydides trap regarding the US and China?
Could I try that one again on me?
And I hope I'm pronouncing this Greek name right. Could the world wars be considered a classic Thucydides trap between Great Britain and Germany? Are we moving towards a new Thucydides trap regarding the US and China?
I'm not sure I know what a Thucydides trap is, but I see what he's saying. Is are we going to have another great power confrontation where a disaster occurs because of an argument between two of the great powers? I don't know. I don't see if we can get a reasonable government on our side of the fence. I don't see why it would necessarily lead to a trap between China and the U.S. Frankly, I would still worry more that what we're going towards is the possibility that just as Serbia touched off World War I with our quarrel with Austria, that North Korea would intervene and cause a crisis that ultimately opens up into the world. That frightens me a lot more than a confrontation between US and China itself, or Russia.
Okay. And then lastly, someone has asked, do you think the economy will get better after the election, no matter who gets in, or will interest rates go up and real estate prices go down?
Let's just say I don't think it's going to get any worse. And that's my safe bet. On the other hand, I think it's a little unclear exactly what a new administration can do given the administrative mess. I think one of the greatest damages that Donald Trump has produced is a world where the administrative structure, the structure of departments and so forth, is a complete mess. I was reading in the Times this morning that all of the various Department of Labor and so on, they're all trying to get a whole bunch of stuff done really quickly before the election, before they have to get out of being president. And the mess that will create, if they in fact do that, will just take a long time to sort through. And I would say that the main thing that will face the new government, and for that matter, it'll face, even if Trump wins, it'll face his government as well, is the organization getting some sort of efficiency back into the organizational structure of the government. That probably in itself will take 6 months, maybe a year.
All right. Well, that's a cheery note. Thank you. I would like to add my thanks to Professor Ransom, as well as Vince Moses and Jared Hoagland, who's the foundation's executive director and has been our tech manager today. The Toward Peace Project will have several other activities. We are hoping to have an interpretive exhibition in the Mission Inn museums, galleries downtown early next year. There will be more lecture presentations like this one as we go forward. And as I said, today's webinar was recorded and someone had asked where to find it. It will be on the Foundation's Facebook page and it should appear fairly quickly. So do look for that and share it out with anyone. So here, Jared has asked me to share, or he sent it to everyone in your chat, perhaps. missioninmuseum.org. Oops. Sorry. So I'll say thank you, everyone. And I hope you all enjoyed it. And we look forward to seeing you at future Toward Peace events.
Bingo.